Here we go, hockey heads. The July 1 window is officially open and fantasy hockey season is already upon us. So much to break down on the latest episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, including all of the biggest winners so far from free agency. Let's get this paper.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to your daily source for fantasy hockey news and betting breakdowns, the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Shout out to the everydayers because you hold us down every single day, making us your first listen. And today, hopefully, this first listen steal is going to give you everything you need in 30 minutes out of the NHL. And we're also bringing the fantasy angles because me, oh my, Steele, we got winners so far of this free agency, this offseason. Teams have made their moves, and teams like the Nashville Predators, New Jersey Devils, and otherwise need to be discussed. Washington Capitals. Who else do I got here? Oilers, Bruins, Kraken. There's all kinds of winners we could be talking about. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. The playoffs are over, but the sports don't stop. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with boosts and bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everybody every single day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. Over to you, my friend. Winners, what are you thinking of? I've got lots of takeaways. We got Stanley Cup odds that have been influenced. We'll get to losers on tomorrow's episode, but today, Tuesday's episode, where do you want to go first? Because I think there's a team in the Nashville Predators that are the obvious number one, if you want to put a top number one. This team is vastly improved, 3 big names, and now they are built to make a run at that cup.
Yeah, clear-cut favorites and clear-cut winners of the trade deadline free agency day, even with a few signings that happened beforehand internally, like with UC Saros especially. They are the clear-cut winners of free agency in the National Hockey League. They get Steven Stamkos. Steven Stamkos to a 4-year, $8 million deal AAV, 7-time 40-goal scorer, 2-time Stanley Cup champion. They also bring in Jonathan Marchessault for 5 years at 5.5 AAV. He's a Conn Smythe winner, a Stanley Cup champion with the Vegas Golden Knights. And of course, they also add on the depth in the blue line area. Brady Shea, 7 years, $7 million AAV. My boy Brady Shea, he had a career year with the Carolina Hurricanes, 47 points, 185 shots, 90 blocks, 70 hits. They bring in Scott Wedgwood, who is a very capable backup goaltender at a very team-friendly deal. 2 years, $1.5 million. And then the re-signings of Alexander Carrier and UC Saros just to put the cherry on top for the Nashville Predators. However, they are slightly over the cap space right now, just shy of just under $200,000 over the cap space. But this is a team that could very easily shed that and get more cap space in the future with all the draft picks and young prospects they have in their lineup right now. So I'm not worried about them being over the cap hit right now. I'm just very ecstatic and very happy with the signings they made of Steven Stamkos, Brady Shea, and Jonathan Marchessault. Like I said, 3 Stanley Cup champions between Marchessault and Steven Stamkos, Brady Shea on the back end. We were just talking about the Nashville Predators the other day, and before any of this happened, I was very comfortable with the Nashville Predators still being a playoff team with just Philip Forsberg, Roman Josi, and Charles. But now you're adding those 3 into the mix with some of the young guys they had. Gustav Nyquist with the year he had last year. Ryan O'Reilly's got that center position down pat. He was stellar for them. And the updated Stanley Cup odds for next year, I believe you just sent them to me. Nashville Predators at plus 2,000. I will be putting a 20 spot on that immediately after we are done recording this episode.
Why not?
I couldn't be more ecstatic for what Nashville just did. They had so much cap space. I think they were just over $26 million in cap space before free agency. They've used it all. They bring in 3-4 top-tier players into their organization. Yeah, maybe on the older side, but the experience, the veteran leadership that they're going to bring to some of these young players in the roster. And again, they just made the playoffs with that roster they just had. this is going to be a whirlwind of a season for the Nashville Predators. I couldn't be more excited for them.
There are a lot of things that I immediately generate in my mind when you go off with those angles because, number one, let me try and get this one out. I saw a little bit of hate towards the deal for Brady Shea, and I understand that it was a long-term deal.
Yeah.
However, the Nashville Predators were in this interesting situation, Steele, of being pesky and being a playoff bubble team, but not being nearly bad enough to bottom out. So not good enough to really go on a deep run, but clearly not bad enough to bottom out and get a really elite draft pick. So Barry Trotz, number 2, thought, absolutely credit due, knocks it out of the park and decides to go the route of, we're good enough, let's try and go all the way. And that's what they're pushing toward. And so Brady Shea, when you look at that deal, yeah, maybe it's a little bit long. This is a complete defenseman, one of the most complete defensemen out there on the market, if not the most complete D-man available. So what does this allow him to do? I think, Steele, Roman Josi, this is huge for him because Brady Shea is going to come in and play some big minutes. I was looking at his stats. His minutes have been steadily going up over the last few seasons. That's a great indication. You know how I feel about that for fantasy as well.
Oh, yeah.
That's going to free up for Roman Josi. That's huge. That's one of my notes here. I love the Wedgwood signing. I think there's also a takeaway to be had here as well, Steele, because as much as I understand this is a 3-headed monster situation for a lot of teams in net, the Toronto Maple Leafs proved this year having Martin Jones in there kind of saved their bacon a little bit at times. Askarov was going to be one of those goalies that we were kind of looking at if we didn't know what was going on with Saros. Now, all of a sudden, Saros is here long-term. He ain't going nowhere. They bring in Scotty Wedgwood, a very capable backup. This means for me, Askarov, his fantasy value definitely hurts there. And someone whose value goes up, Tommy Novak is now going to get to maybe center Jonathan Marchessault and Tommy Novak. Just to get another note off of my top of my notes here for Nashville, that is a guy who just won big in the offseason, and I'll be looking at him and the rest of this Nashville team as one of those, you and I like to say this, mine this team for fantasy gold because all of a sudden they have a bunch of really good options.
The fantasy value for a lot of these young guys, especially like you said, Tommy Novak being potentially playing with Steven Stamkos and Jonathan Marchessault on that second line is going to be huge for his fantasy value. This is a guy, again, last year who you could pick up on a bi-weekly basis every now and again, chips away offensively. Again, just a very young guy, young players on this team. Luke Evangelista, Juuso Parssinen, Tommy Novak, like we mentioned. So it's going to be very helpful for their fantasy value, especially Tommy Novak in that top 6 group of the Nashville Predators. But what does it also mean for Steven Stamkos and Jonathan Marchessault? They're very familiar with each other's game when Jonathan Marchessault was in Tampa Bay for the 2 seasons he was with the Lightning. I think it's going to be very interesting, and I'm very highly expecting some big seasons all around. I mean, Philip Forsberg, 80-plus points with the players he was playing with. Roman Josi, Gustav Nyquist, again, had a very solid season. Ryan O'Reilly was great, but this is going to be huge for the power play for the Nashville Predators. Exactly. This is going to be huge for special teams as well overall. But fantasy value-wise, like you said, this is an absolute gold mine to pick from. And Tommy Novak is going to be one of those sleeper, sneaky picks later in the draft potentially. You don't want to pick him up too high because you still don't know what he's going to bring. We've seen guys play with top-tier players in the NHL and still struggle. Matthew Nyes, Robertson, some of the guys from the Maple Leafs, just for an example. But Tommy Novak is going to be on the radar for a lot of GMs out there fantasy league-wise. So I love that you're bringing him up. And like you said, this is just an absolute fantasy gold mine right now. Nashville Predators knocked it out of the park. They won free agency by a mile.
We're going to talk about some other teams right around the break. We're going to talk about our losers from free agency, from the offseason so far in general, because, Steele, some of these teams we're going to talk about after the break for the rest of today's episode are also teams that made some interesting moves before the July 1st window, and I think that is going to all impart on fantasy impacts. Let me just wrap up Nashville with this. This isn't one of those situations where a couple of good players came into a bad offensive team and they were just really looking to rejuvenate their offense. The Nashville Predators scored the 10th most goals in the NHL last year. So you're almost just making a good team even better. That's what we're looking at. And your point about the power play is where I think this helps the most. And it holds true because they did sit outside the top half in power play efficiency last year, clicked at the 16th best % in the league last season. at, let me bring up the percentage, Steele, 21%. So okay, not great, not horrible, but you bring in an offensive specialist, a power play specialist in Steven Stamkos. Just that would have me excited. Then you add in the wrinkle of Shea, you add in the wrinkle of Marcia. So it's exciting. The rest of today's episode, exciting. I know Steele and I are going to have some differing of opinions coming up. Perhaps the Seattle Kraken are going to be a hot spot. Let's talk about it. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. We love sports. We love them so much. We never want them to stop. The playoffs are over, but FanDuel lets us keep betting on sports all summer long. FanDuel is hooking up customers all summer long with a boost or daily bonus. That's right. There's something for everybody every day, all summer long. Head to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball.
And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Continue to hit the subscribe button, the follow button, leave a 5-star review. We appreciate all that love and support you show us Monday through Friday. Also, make sure you go check out Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest and hottest stories without all the screaming from Fox Sports or ESPN. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, news, and opinions streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channel app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Flip, I believe this was the first time in NHL history that over $1 billion was spent on day one or just in general of NHL free agency. Money was being handed out to a lot of superstars in the NHL.
Crazy day.
A lot of teams upgraded their roster.
It's true.
We both had Nashville as the winners of this free agency day, free agency frenzy. That's on your list. That was clear cut, very easy one to choose from. But number 2 on the list, this is, again, there's a lot of winners out there, but this is just top 3 for both Flip and I. I'll throw it back over to you. Sure. Who comes in at number 2 right behind the Nashville Predators as winners of free agency frenzy?
Perhaps before I provide that answer, would it be best that I provide some honorable mentions? Because as you alluded to very eloquently there, I think there were, as we're going to talk about the clear-cut losers tomorrow, which I do think there were a number of them, there were a number of teams that I think should deserve credit. Yeah, there were teams that I think really took themselves from on the edge to over it. Obviously, the Preds being one of them, but here's a couple of honorable mentions. Shout out to the Boston Bruins. They deserve some love. 2 big names. Yeah. I think Elias Lindholm's going to be huge. Zadorov, perfect fit for that blue line. So shout out to the Bruins. I know the terms. I know some of the money there could have been debated. They make honorable mention for me. The Utah Yeti getting their number 1 guy in Sergachev. I know some people were out there saying he's a number 2. He is good enough to be a number 1 blue liner.
Yeah.
Fantasy, you could maybe talk about otherwise, and he's had major injuries, but in my opinion, he's good enough to be a number 1 D-man. So I love Tij Ginla. Going to give a little love to the Yeti, and I got 2 more teams, and you might disagree with me on these. Blackhawks and Sharks, I think, did a really good job, especially the Blackhawks, with Teravainen and Bertuzzi, bringing in players to play with their superstar young gun in Connor Bedard. And I have a little note here for the Sharks. Toffoli and Celebrini. Celebrini comes in and is able to play in a veteran that gets a good look to score some goals into Foley. So a little bit of love go to the Blackhawks and the Sharks, in my opinion, for making teams that were really bad last year just slightly better. I like what they did, but Steele, for me, and I'm going to spit this out, I can let you disagree or agree with that, along with the Edmonton Oilers. The Edmonton Oilers were right there on the doorstep, knocking on it, and one of the reasons that they couldn't get it done, Leon Draisaitl was playing with Warren Fogle, and I don't even know who else in the last game of that series, and it was really not good. So you bring in a guy like Arvidsson, who I think fits Knobloch's system so well, and Jeff Skinner, a guy who obviously has his defensive deficiencies, but alongside a guy like Draisaitl or McDavid feeding him the biscuit, a 30-goal man 6 times in the NHL, boom. The Edmonton Oilers, in my opinion, big winners. They addressed the offensive depth, which is what caught up to them in the end when they didn't get the cup.
That's a massive signing for the Edmonton Oilers and Victor Arvidsson getting into that top 6 group. This might be the best top 6 group that Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl have been able to play with since being with the Edmonton Oilers. Again, the top line of Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Connor McDavid, Zach Hyman, and then a second line of Draisaitl, Jeff Skinner, and Victor Arvidsson. I love what Jeff Skinner is going to bring offensively. You and I had a difference of opinions yesterday on what this means for him fantasy-wise or just overall about his game. But this is still a guy who can dominate in the offensive zone. And fantasy-wise, now that he gets to play with Leon Draisaitl and Victor Arvidsson,
sure.
He's going to be huge for them. And for 1 year, I believe it's 1 year, $3 million. It's massive for the Edmonton Oilers. So can't agree with you more that the Oilers should also be a winner of free agency day. An honorable mention for me, and this is why they didn't crack the top three, because a lot of their upgrades and roster changes came via trade, but it's the Washington Capitals. They have clearly made and pinpointed what they want this future team to look like, and they made some massive changes. Getting Pierre-Luc Dubois, trading for Andrew Mangiapane, signing Brandon Duhaime and Taylor Radish, trading for Jacob Chychrun, trading for Logan Thompson as well. This is a major change throughout the top and bottom of the Washington Capitals. They don't make it because a lot of this was via trade, but I love what Washington has done so far, and this is going to be a different Washington Capitals team moving forward, and they're doing everything in their power to get Alexander Ovechkin another Stanley Cup before he retires when it's all said and done. So love what Washington Capitals have also done throughout their lineup. Number 2 on my list, it's the New Jersey Devils. And there's lots of reasons. Again, via trade, 2 of my favorite for them was Jacob Markstrom, clearly with the trade with the Calgary Flames. But I also love the trade for Paul Cotter with the Vegas Golden Knights. He is going to be a very sound bottom 6, potentially get into the... he won't be top 6. No, he'll be a very sound bottom 6. He brings the physicality. He has a lot of skill that gets unrecognized for what he brings to the NHL, but he's a big guy who's going to be playing some big minutes for them in the bottom 6, and he can really shoot the puck and show out his skill when he needs to. So I love the trades for New Jersey. Acquiring both Jacob Markstrom, they get their number 1 goalie, and they also get Paul Cotter. But the signings they made the other day, they bolster their blue line. Brendan Dillon, 3 years, $4 million AAV. Brett Pesce, 6 years, $5.5 AAV. They also get Stefan Nason of the Carolina Hurricanes, 3 years, $2.75 AAV. They
got Brendan Dillon too. Did you mention that one? I forgot.
Yeah, I mentioned Brendan Dillon as well. So they bolster up their blue line. I just want to pull them up on Daily Faceoff to see the lineups, projected lineups of what they have right now. But they bolster up their blue line. Jonas Siegenthaler, Dougie Hamilton when he comes back from injury, Luke Hughes and Brett Pesce, Brendan Dillon and Simon Nemec. That's a great blue line.
Some big boys back there as well, Steele.
And they get bigger with all 3 of those guys. Paul Cotter, Brendan Dillon, Brett Pesce. They get some size to them. They bring some physicality. I love what New Jersey's doing as well. They're filling out their bottom 6. Paul Cotter and Stefan Nason now making up that 3rd line. You didn't have to do anything with the top 6 group. Jack Hughes, Nico Hischier, Timo Meier, Jesper Bratt. You had it sound there. You needed some help with the depth scoring. You need some help on the blue line with some size and physicality. You get help. Again, another team that addressed everything top to bottom. They get their number 1 goaltender in Jacob Markstrom. They have to be on the list for me. They make it to number 2 for the winners of free agency frenzy.
I had Preds at 1. I had Oilers at 2. I had Devils at 3. And then I had a number of I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 honorable mentions, and I missed 2 of them, Steele. The Seattle Kraken were one of my honorable mentions as well, and so were the Washington Capitals. I do want to touch on your Washington Capitals point, and then I want to touch on your New Jersey Devils point. Let's do that right after the break, though, because I know we are going to keep rambling, and I got a few more points to get off the head top here, and I know you want to talk about the Seattle Kraken team, I assume. So let's get to it right after the break.
So much to talk about. Make sure you're staying tuned in for tomorrow's episode where we talk about our 3 losers of free agency frenzy. After the break, we'll get to our 3rd winner of free agency frenzy. That's coming up right after the break. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Continue to hit the subscribe button, the follow button, leave a 5-star review. We appreciate all that love and support you show us Monday through Friday. 7 o'clock in the morning is when you can find our episodes. Throughout the summer, though, they're going to be dropping here and there throughout the afternoon. So stay tuned for 12 and 1 p.m. Eastern time drops. Yep. That's when most of these episodes will be releasing throughout the week. We're getting busy summer season. We're doing what we can, but You got to stay on top of it with free agency frenzy, the draft, everything going on. Number 3 on the list, I know you want to address the Washington Capitals as well, and then talk about the New Jersey Devils, so I'll throw it back over to you.
Super fast. The high risk, high reward, or high risk, potential high reward situations with Jacob Trickett and Pierre-Luc Dubois. Obviously, both players have their deficiencies. Both players have now had a fresh start situation. Pierre-Luc Dubois, a couple, and they haven't panned out.
Another fresh start.
Another fresh start. So here is another one for Pierre-Luc Dubois, a third one for Chychrun, or a second. Your points about Logan Thompson, though, they bring in another blue liner in Roy. I always butcher those. The influence, though, that John Carlson can potentially have on Chychrun is one thing I'm looking at. And the influence that Alex Ovechkin potentially can have on Pierre-Luc Dubois is another. And then you sprinkle in Logan Thompson and Charlie Lindgren. All of a sudden, that's a very solid tandem of goaltenders. And my other takeaway here is just to finish it on the Caps, even though this is about the Vegas Golden Knights, is the Vegas Golden Knights put Ilya Samsonov in net behind Adin Hill. To me, that tells me, and after shipping out Logan Thompson, that not like it wasn't Adin Hill's crease before, but Adin Hill is now most definitely going to see a slight uptick in games played. In my opinion, if he can stay healthy, I see his value even going upwards next season. So I just wanted to get that off the chest. And thank you so much for bringing up the New Jersey Devils, because just getting Markstrom, if they did nothing else, Cotter, Pesce, Dillon, which I love them rounding it out, like you said, all the studs up front, Bratt, Mercer, Hughes, the list goes on, and that's not even in talking about the young blue liners they have. This team now, all of a sudden, I'm writing it right here, blue line full of big boys. Markstrom, young forward depth equals cup run. They have all of the tools to do it. Am I saying they're cup champs? Obviously not, Steele. That Metro division is full of killers. But Vegas agrees with me, because after the Panthers, Oilers, and Dallas Stars, the New Jersey Devils have now moved into the 4th favorite for the Stanley Cup next season at plus 1,100. So I want to agree with you on all fronts there. But why don't you hit me with the final team on your top 3 winners list so far this offseason?
Number 3, I got to talk about them because they made probably the most amount of signings and re-signings during free agency day 1. The Toronto Maple Leafs come in at number 3, and they might not be the biggest.
This is a shocker.
It's a shocker.
Whoa.
It might not be they might not be the biggest names out there on the free agency market, but they made a lot of signings, and they've really ruffled up this team, and they're going into the new season with a new look. I know
I still thought you were going to say the Kraken. My bad.
No. Kraken don't make the top 3. But look, They made a lot of signings. They made a lot of changes to this team. The core 4 remain, their core 5, including Morgan Riley, remain intact, and they're continuing this. They're continuing this push with the core 4, core 5. And this is big changes all around for the Toronto Maple Leafs, especially on the blue line. Again, just over the cap hit. Just under $800,000. So they're going to have to get under the cap once the season starts, obviously. But this is major changes for the Toronto Maple Leafs. They signed Yanni Hakanpää, 2 years, $1.5 million. Great
I like
deal.
that one.
Anthony Stolarz, 2 years, $2.5 million. Love that deal after the season he just had. I know he was the backup goaltender, but a .925 save percentage, a 2.03 goals against average, and a 16.72 record. I see Anthony Stolarz and Joseph Woll splitting the rotation throughout the season, sort of what we saw with the Boston Bruins, with Jeremy Swayman and Linus Ullmark and a few other teams. But I could definitely see them, again, with Joseph Woll's injury. You want to make sure you're not overplaying him. You want to make sure you're using both goaltenders, utilizing them properly. So I love the signing. Speaking of Joseph Woll, he also signs the 3-year, 3.66 AAV. A little bit high on my end. I think, maybe 3 million, just under 3 million would have been fine for a guy who's only got over 40, 50 games of NHL experience and who's dealt with injuries. Would have liked to see it a little bit lower, but I still like Joseph Woll returning. They re-signed Max Domi, 4 years, 3.75 million. Great team-friendly deal. Timothy Liljegren,
I like that one.
You got to love the Max Domi signing. And then they make some changes on the blue line, like we said. Chris Tanev, 6 years, $4.5 million. Oliver Ekman-Larsson, now Stanley Cup champion, 4 years, $3.5 million. They've changed the blue line. They're going in a different direction. Brad Treliving is making his mark on the Toronto Maple Leafs squad right now. He leaves the core five intact. He makes the changes on the blue line. He brings in Anthony Stolarz, who played very well last year. They also re-signed Matt Murray to a 1-year, $875,000 deal.
Yeah,
They're going
that's
with that
that point I was
monster.
making about needing 3
yeah,
goalies.
exactly. The 3 goaltenders. So now that you're a little bit worried about Joseph Wall's injury, Anthony Stolarz not being a clear-cut number 1. Now you've got 3 goaltenders that you can really rely on. Hopefully Matt Murray, if he's fully healthy, if he can get into the lineup and even be half of what he was with the Pittsburgh Penguins, I would really love this deal. But 1 year under $1 million. I love what the Toronto Maple Leafs have done. They're just over the cap hit, so they're going to have to make some trades and clear up some cap space just to get under. But regardless of all that, they've clearly made the changes they needed to on the blue line. And I really like the Anthony Stolarz signing. He's going to be a goaltender that I definitely look at for fantasy leagues.
The Leafs fell into the realm of teams for me, Steele, because what you're saying, it's overall positive. I like it, and I do like the Chris Tanev ad for sure, along with Stolarz. Those 2 moves are very sneaky for me, and I know Chris Tanev. People are out here talking about that was a lot of money in term for a D-man. Whatever, the Leafs needed him. And he would have gotten similar money on a lot of other teams. So the classic Toronto Maple Leafs hate towards Chris Tanev, a very good defenseman defensively who can absolutely shut down a top lines forward group. He blocks a ton of shots. Almost every team in the NHL could use a Chris Tanev. So all that hate towards Chris Tanev all of a sudden because he's a Maple Leaf, I hate that garbage. So number 1, the Toronto Maple Leafs just became a much tougher team to play against, bringing in Chris Tanev on the back end, just full stop. And they needed a lot of that. When I look at this lineup, Steele, obviously up front, they have some of the best talent up there. That angle has been covered. But when you look at the up-and-coming Matty Nyes, a good season from Bobby McCann, they have Connor Dewar in there now for a full season. You mentioned Treliving making his mark on this team, and now they're starting to really look like a much tougher team to play against, and that's what they need, because I love David Kampf on the defensive end. Some of these pieces that they have now, Chris Tanev, Anthony Stolarz, that security blanket, this team is going to be better defensively, and we know that has been their Achilles heel amongst other things. But one of the big reasons why I give you credit for putting them in your winners list, they wouldn't have made mine. They fall into a realm of I'm unsure, Steele. I don't know what this means for this team. That's just because how badly I just want them to win. I have my eyes all over Joseph Wall, though. I'll leave it with this for you, and we can wrap it up. We'll come back tomorrow with our losers. Joseph Wall obviously has what it takes to win at this level. And maybe the biggest question out there that everyone knows, and we don't need to talk about, it's obviously his health. But maybe Anthony Stolarz now, a guy coming in as a Stanley Cup champion, a veteran, a guy who was also coming off a pretty good of a heater of the end of a season, and he's going to be ready to play. And if Joseph Wall's not, he's going to take his minutes. Maybe that pushes him to be the professional on and off the ice that he needs. Because if I'm Joseph Wall right now going, okay, I got a real goalie behind me, no disrespect to Samsonov, I might be pushing myself a little bit harder to make sure I am that athlete on and off the ice that can be a number 1 goaltender. That's how I'm looking at it.
Oh, completely fair. And regardless of what happens with all 3 of these teams, there's so much fantasy value to be taken with all these players. Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault, Jacob Markstrom now with the New Jersey Devils. He's going to be a hot commodity fantasy goalie-wise. Again, some of these players on the defensive end, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Chris Tanev, with the peripherals that they bring to the game and potential of what Oliver Ekman-Larsson can do on the power play. If things don't pan out with Morgan Riley, they can change things up and throw Oliver Ekman-Larsson on that top unit. Again, so much fantasy value to be had around these 3 teams. So much fantasy value for a lot of teams we mentioned: Washington Capitals, Edmonton Oilers, Seattle Kraken. There's a lot of winners out there.
On the Washington Capitals.
Connor McMichael as well.
Top 6.
Absolutely, so much fantasy value around with all 6 of these teams that we mentioned. But clear-cut favorites, Nashville Predators, are going to be picking them up from that gold mine throughout the draft.
Sir.
So you got to look out. You got to be checking the news. You got to be looking out at the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast, making it your first listen every single day. Once again, make sure you go check out Locked On Sports Day, the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. You can also find it now on the free Amazon Fire TV channel app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I. Have a great day out there. Good luck with all your bets this summer, and we shall see you back here again tomorrow for the top three losers of free agency.
Peace.